July 1943. Camp Concordia, Kansas. Before sunrise, the prairie is still blue with night, and the wind moves through the wire as if it has forgotten there is a war on. The barracks sweat out the trapped heat of sleeping bodies. Somewhere beyond the stockade, a kitchen door opens. Metal strikes metal. A ladle scrapes the bottom of a steaming vat. Toast jumps from a rack in rows, pale and crisp, carrying the smell of scorched bread into the dark. Then comes the richer scent beneath it, salted beef softened in white gravy, milk turned thick, flour turned velvet, army food made warm enough to resemble mercy. In that hour, before the first order, before the first work detail, before the first guard tower catches the sun, a slice of white toast becomes something larger than breakfast. It becomes a rumor of another world. The men who smelled it had not been raised to expect such a world. Most of them had come through defeat in North Africa or the later collapse of German armies in France, and they arrived carrying the inner furniture of Hitler's Europe: discipline, hunger, exhaustion, and a head full of propaganda. They had been taught that America was soft, mongrel, decadent, racially divided, and spiritually weak. They had been taught that democracy was a noisy mask for disorder, that abundance made men inferior, and that hardship alone made nations worthy of history. Some had been told American cities were already burning under Luftwaffe attack. Others imagined a land rich in machines but poor in soul. Then capture came, and with capture came transport, and with transport came the long inland movement through a continent that did not look bombed, starving, or near collapse. Arnold Kramer's classic study notes that more than 150,000 prisoners from the North African campaign formed the first massive influx, and between May and October 1943, an average of 20,000 prisoners a month arrived in the United States. By May 1945, the U.S. held 425,871 Axis POWs, including 371,683 Germans. The numbers matter because they reveal scale, but scale alone does not explain the shock. The United States had not prepared for this on such a vast level. Yet, across the interior, it built and adapted a vast prison camp geography, 141 permanent camps, and 319 branch camps by May 1945, according to Kramer, while other archival overviews put the broader total of base and branch sites above 500. These camps were not improvised pens. They were organized compounds with barracks, mess halls, infirmaries, recreation buildings, canteens, chapels, workshops, and station hospitals. The architecture of captivity was severe, but it was also ordered, bureaucratic, and most disorienting to many German prisoners, predictable. And behind that order stood a legal principle whose consequences could be tasted before they were understood. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required that prisoners receive adequate food, sanitary care, and medical services. And in American administration, this was reduced to a blunt operational rule. Enemy prisoners were to receive treatment approximating that of American troops. That was not born of sentimentality. It was strategy, reciprocity, and national self-interest dressed in the language of law. The United States knew its own sons were prisoners too. If Germans in Kansas or Texas or Maine were fed decently, perhaps Americans in German hands might live another week. In Kramer's words, the War Department treated the convention as both a humanitarian document and a shield for Americans held by the enemy. So the breakfast the Germans encountered was not an accident. It belonged to a military system. The dish American soldiers called SOS creamed, chipped beef on toast had already been part of U.S. Army food culture for decades. Its roots can be traced in documented military cookery, at least to the 1910 Manual of Army Cooks, where chipped beef appeared in large-scale recipe form, and by the Second World War, it had become one of those meals men mocked, remembered, and kept eating. HistoryNet's survey of the dish notes that in garrison it was typically served over toast, while in field conditions it often went over biscuits. A later wartime recipe in TM 10-412 from August 1944 simplified it further. This was not luxury cuisine. It was institutional abundance. Preserved meat, evaporated milk, flour, bread, fuel, transport, timing. A democracy industrialized enough to be ordinary about food could turn a joke into a system. That is why the shock of SOS on toast was never really about elegance. It was about proportion. To an American private, it might have seemed like same old slop. To a hungry German prisoner, it arrived as a contradiction. White bread alone could do that. White bread that's soft, bread not rationed like treasure, bread toasted not for ceremony but for routine, suggested something about the country that produced it. The toast becomes important here because it returns again and again through the record, whether in direct memory, implication, or atmosphere. A slice of white toast is wheat turned into certainty. It is a field, a rail line, a mill, a warehouse, a kitchen, a timetable, a truck, and enough confidence in tomorrow to brown bread for men behind wire. Imagine one of those prisoners in the line that morning, not a named hero, but a composite of hundreds of young Wehrmacht men carried west by defeat. He is 19, perhaps 21, old enough to have believed speeches, young enough to have confused volume with truth. He has stood in the desert where flies settled on lips before the dead cooled. He has eaten from tins, chewed crusts, meant to last longer than hope, watched supply lines fail, and learned the arithmetic of war in reverse. Fewer shells, thinner soup, less fuel, fewer letters, less Germany. Now he stands in an American camp and watches a cook lower a ladle into white gravy, streaked with chipped beef. The gravy spills over toast that has been allotted invisible, individual slices. Not one pan for a squad to scrape. Not one pot to fear will empty before his turn. Individual slices. Plenty is always most offensive to an ideology that glorifies scarcity. He does not yet know what the dish is called. He only sees that it is warm, pale, and absurdly generous. He sees that the man ahead of him receives one plate, and the next man receives one plate, and no one seems astonished by this repetition. That may be the deepest shock of all. In dictatorships, abundance is theatrical. It appears in parades, in staged photographs, in the leader's promises. In functioning supply systems, abundance is boring. It appears at dawn in a mess line. It appears on toast. Many German prisoners arrived expecting humiliation and discovered routine instead. Some of the most revealing testimony comes not from propaganda pieces after the war, but from fragments preserved around camp life and recollection. One account cited in research on the camps remembered prisoners pressing their noses to train windows and seeing the abundance of automobiles everywhere. Another former prisoner later recalled, simply, "As soon as we were in American hands, we had it good." Another called being in the United States the luckiest time of my life, while also admitting the guilt of eating well while home was collapsing. These are not sentimental lines if read properly. They are ideological fractures recorded by men who had been told another story. The camp itself reinforced that fracture. The German soldier had been formed inside a machine that prized hardness, hierarchy, obedience, and endurance. Captivity should have confirmed everything he had been taught about enemies. Instead, American bureaucracy often behaved with an almost insulting consistency. The wounded received treatment. Prisoners were fingerprinted, photographed, registered, and moved through systems. Their pay for labor, in many camp arrangements, was fixed according to rule. In Maine, for example, local reporting on Camp Holton recalled that POWs earned wages and that Red Cross inspectors in 1944 gave the camp high marks for prisoner treatment. Across the larger system, POW labor became economically significant. NARA records show that from June 1944 to August 1945, prisoners provided 851,994 man-months of labor. That labor matters to the story because breakfast was not separate from work. Food was fuel, and fuel meant fields cleared, potatoes harvested, roads maintained, timber cut, military posts serviced. The same country that could ship tanks across oceans could also put toast under gravy before dawn and then send a column of prisoners to the fields by truck or train. In the American camp system, food was never only nutrition. It was administration. It was evidence. It proved to guards, inspectors, locals, and prisoners that the system was functioning. And when systems function in wartime, they acquire moral meaning whether they intend to or not. There is a temptation in stories like this to turn that moral meaning into innocence. History refuses that simplification. The American POW camps were not utopias. They were prison camps. They were ringed with wire and towers. Men had lost wars there. Many were frightened, ashamed, or furious. Some wanted only to survive and go home. Some were still committed Nazis. Some carried guilt only after Germany lost, which is a cheaper kind of awakening. And inside the camps, the failure of early American administration to separate hardened Nazis from others allowed a dark internal order to thrive. Kramer records that Nazi influence in many camps grew powerful enough to produce intimidation, violence, and what he described as a reign of terror between prisoners, including 6 murders, 2 forced suicides, and 43 voluntary suicides in one period. This darker layer is essential because it reveals that a plate of food alone does not defeat an ideology. A man can eat well and still worship cruelty. He can admire American bread and still believe in German racial myth. He can laugh at the guards and terrorize an anti-Nazi bunkmate after lights out. In one extraordinary memo preserved by Kramer, anti-Nazi prisoner Friedrich Schiltz pleaded with camp authorities, writing that the Nazis' discipline was all facade and asking why those who are your enemies are respected while those seeking protection were despised. The line matters because it exposes the limit of material abundance. Toast can crack certainty. It cannot, by itself, create courage. Even so, certainty did crack. It cracked slowly, often humiliatingly, and not always where anyone expected. It cracked in railway windows when prisoners saw unbombed American towns sliding past mile after mile. It cracked in canteens when the cigarettes were real, the bread soft, the coffee not burnt acorn substitute but something richer. It cracked in hospitals when treatment was given without theatrical hatred. It cracked when farm wives sat and tasted the soup in front of frightened POW laborers so that they would know it was not poisoned. It cracked when guards obeyed rules, even when prisoners assumed rules were only weapons. The Holton memories preserve one farmer's wife doing exactly that, eating the soup herself first to reassure the German workers. In another recollection from that same world, a prisoner who had feared being ordered to dig his own grave discovered he was digging a cesspool instead. Terror met bureaucracy, and, for once, bureaucracy was gentler. The breakfast dish becomes a perfect symbol because Americans themselves barely respected it. They joked about SOS. They renamed it in vulgar barracks slang. They rolled their eyes at it. HistoryNet quotes World War II veteran Jerry Stearns remembering how the menu called it cream-chipped beef on toast, while the men called it SOS. He wrote that after smelling it in a mess hall before dawn and seeing mounds of hamburger being cooked in big pans, a milk and flour sauce being prepared, and hundreds of bread slices being toasted, he became an instant fan. That memory, on the American side, is almost cheerful in its familiarity, but place a German prisoner beside it, and the same breakfast transforms into a revelation. The American jokes prove the point. A nation rich enough to mock its own provisions is richer than the nation that teaches hunger as virtue. Picture the scene again, but now with more history inside it. The German line shuffles forward. The men hold metal trays. Somewhere the stale expressions of recent capture, those blank faces shaped by disbelief more than fear. The guards look tired, not triumphant. The cook works as if breakfast were not history at all. Bread, gravy, beef. Bread, gravy, beef. Every army in the world has fed men. Not every army has fed them in a way that exposes its own underlying civilization. The chipped beef itself is preserved meat, old military practicality. The gravy is alchemy, turning ration components into warmth. But the toast white, square, evenly browned toast feels almost indecent to men who have come from ration cards, ersatz coffee, shrinking portions, and a state that had promised empire while failing to feed reality. Some prisoners distrusted the abundance. That too is human. Propaganda does not die in a single meal. There were men who suspected they were being staged, handled, shown only America's clean side. There were others who believed such food could not be standard issue, that this must be a temporary display arranged for prisoners, Red Cross inspectors, or some invisible camera. This suspicion has a tragic grandeur to it. When ideological worlds begin to fail, the first instinct is not conversion but suspicion. If reality contradicts belief, then reality must be cheating. Yet the days kept coming. The breakfasts kept coming. The farms kept yielding. The trains kept running. The guards' own plates looked no different from the ones prisoners saw. Repetition, more than spectacle, did the deepest damage to the myth. And beyond breakfast lay the larger landscape of American plenty. Prisoners moving through the United States saw cars, roads, long fields, warehouses, depots, and towns where civilian life continued with a fullness that war-weary Europe could barely imagine. The Crowley thesis on German POW re-education records the astonishment of prisoners looking from train windows at the scale of America and the visible density of consumer life. To men from a continent rationed by war and drilled by authoritarian scarcity, the sight of ordinary abundance was not just impressive, it was destabilizing. Nazi ideology had promised that democracies were weak because they were material, and now material civilization appeared not weak but overwhelmingly effective. Here the toast becomes more than food. It becomes a thesis in miniature. A single slice says the wheat harvest was large enough. The mills worked, the rail cars arrived, the fuel came, the cooks had time. The command expected tomorrow. In total war, confidence is edible. This is why armies care so much about breakfast. Breakfast tells men what kind of future the institution imagines for them. Starvation says there may be no future. A ration stretched into something hot says you will work today and probably again tomorrow. Toast says there is enough not merely to survive, but to arrange survival into form. The transformation in prisoner perception did not happen evenly. Many remained unmoved. Some became more bitter precisely because the contrast was so obvious. It is hard to admit you have been lied to by the system that shaped your youth. Harder still when the proof comes from an enemy you were trained to despise. But enough changed for historians of the camps to notice. Later efforts at re-education, including lectures, newspapers, screenings, and structured political exposure, tried to move German prisoners toward democratic thinking. Those efforts had mixed results and were never purely idealistic, yet they did not begin on blank ground. The first lessons had already arrived in humbler form: clean bedding, regular meals, visible law, and the intolerably ordinary miracle of enough bread. Research on the re-education program makes clear that the United States sought not only to contain prisoners but to expose them to another political culture altogether. What changed some men was not that Americans were saintly. It was that Americans were inconsistent in human ways rather than systematic in inhuman ones. Guards could be bored, annoyed, petty, even rough, but they were operating inside rules that could be inspected, appealed to, and documented. Red Cross visits mattered. Paperwork mattered. Mail mattered. Camp grievances mattered enough to be written down. The bureaucratic state that so often seems lifeless in peace can, in war, become one of civilization's last defenses. To a prisoner of the Third Reich, this could feel strange beyond words. In a dictatorship, paper serves power. In a rules-bound democracy, power must increasingly serve paper. That distinction can begin with breakfast rosters and end with a changed political imagination. By late war, the American camp system had become one of the largest, strangest social laboratories of the conflict. Men who had marched under swastikas were now cutting timber in Maine, harvesting on Midwestern farms, or maintaining military installations in the interior of the United States. Communities that had first feared them often revised that fear after contact. The Holton recollections say local suspicion softened as townspeople came to see the prisoners not as mythic enemies, but as just boys, just like our boys. This was not forgiveness in any full moral sense. It was recognition. Democracies survive partly because they force the human face back into abstract categories. Recognition can be dangerous too. Too much sentiment risks washing away the crimes of the regime these men served. The prisoner in line for SOS may have been merely conscripted, or he may have believed deeply in conquest. He may have watched atrocities without intervention. He may have cursed Jews, Poles, Russians, and democracy itself. A cinematic script worthy of the period cannot turn him into a pure innocent because he encountered toast in Kansas. What it can do is show the moment when ideology meets material truth and hesitates, not surrenders, hesitates. History often changes in that hesitation. A slice of toast may seem too small a thing to bear this meaning, yet wars are decided by large forces and remembered through small objects: a helmet, a photograph, a canteen cup, a spoon, a crust of bread. The white toast in this story matters because it sits at the meeting point of all the locked rules of wartime existence: supply, morale, law, labor, habit, and belief. To Americans, it was breakfast under chipped beef. To some German prisoners, it was the first edible hint that the world they had been promised and the world that actually existed were not the same world. The contrast sharpened every time they compared it with memory. Back home by the later war years, German civilians and soldiers alike had learned the humiliations of substitution: coffee without coffee, butter without butter, victory speeches without victory. Even before total collapse, the Reich had been asking its people to metabolize ideology in place of food. The American breakfast line offered the opposite proposition. Here, ideology was almost invisible, hidden under procedure. No poster announced democracy on the toast. No loudspeaker explained freedom through gravy. Yet the lesson was there, not stated, demonstrated. This is one reason post-war memory about American captivity could become so morally confusing. Many former German POWs remembered the camps in the United States with gratitude, some even with nostalgia. They remembered sports, mail, labor, tolerable treatment, cigarettes, classes, music, and enough food. That memory was real. It should not be censored. But it must be held beside the darker reality that these same camps also sheltered Nazi intimidation, that many prisoners had served a monstrous regime, and that kind treatment in captivity did not erase what Germany had done across Europe. The truth is uncomfortable precisely because it is truth. A just system may treat unjust men better than their own system treated anyone. And so the toast remains, morning after morning, sometimes in a mess hall, sometimes glimpsed on an American plate, sometimes in imagination more than record. It keeps returning because it is ordinary, and ordinary things are the hardest for propagandists to counterfeit. A parade can lie, a speech can lie, a poster can lie, even a staged banquet can lie. But routine is expensive to fake. Routine requires infrastructure. Routine requires culture. Routine requires a state whose promises have sunk down into logistics. When the German prisoners saw toast made plentiful, not celebrated, they were encountering the hidden architecture of American power. There's another irony here. The United States was feeding these men with a dish its own soldiers often mocked. That is almost too perfect for documentary writing, but history loves such moments. The enemy expected cruelty and found a joke meal. Not roast pheasant, not silver service, not a conquering feast, just SOS. Salted beef and white gravy over bread. Unromantic food, mass food. Food with a nickname obscene enough to prove the men eating it were free to complain. That freedom to complain is itself democratic evidence. An army that allows mockery of the menu is not the same kind of army as one that demands reverence while issuing shortages. Even the record of recipes carries symbolic weight. The 1910 Army Manual gave quantities scaled for 60 men, a reminder that this was system food, not domestic improvisation. By 1944, the recipe had evolved, simplified, adapted, and endured. Such continuity matters in war. It tells us the United States did not merely have ingredients. It had institutions capable of teaching, replicating, and distributing those ingredients across a military empire. The same national machine that built Liberty ships and heavy bombers also standardized breakfast. That may sound trivial until one remembers that total war is won as much by repeatable adequacy as by heroic exception. For the prisoners, the effect of that adequacy could be deeply personal. A young German might begin by hoarding crusts out of instinct. He might save sugar packets. He might eye the tray as if expecting a hand to snatch it away. He might eat too quickly, then feel shame at his own urgency. Later, after days or weeks, he might slow down. The body often surrenders to abundance before the mind does. Hunger creates habits of secrecy. Regular meals create the possibility of thought. And once a man begins to think, ideology becomes vulnerable. This does not mean the American camps remade Germany by breakfast. History is never that tidy. The deepest transformations usually happened where material experience met reflection. In classes, reading, conversations, work details, and comparison with home. The Crowley thesis on re-education emphasizes that the American program sought to introduce prisoners to democratic ideology, but results remained mixed. Some men learned, some only adapted, some remained faithful to older hatreds. Still, the effort existed because American authorities gradually understood that the camps were not just storage spaces for enemy manpower. They were contact zones between political worlds. One can almost hear the recurring soundtrack of that contact zone. Not speeches, not gunfire, smaller sounds, a toaster rack knocking, enamel trays sliding, boots on barracks boards, tin cups set down after coffee, wire humming in prairie wind. The rhythm of a camp morning, which is also the rhythm of a state proving itself in miniature. The Reich had promised destiny and delivered attrition. America, for all its faults and contradictions, often delivered breakfast. There is something profoundly cinematic in that reversal, because it resists melodrama. No violin swell is needed, no speech of enlightenment, no confessional scene under a guard tower, only men looking down at a plate and realizing that the enemy's ordinary life is richer than the myth they were fed. That realization hurts, because it rearranges the moral map. If the decadent democracy can feed prisoners like this, what else in the old teaching was false? If white bread is abundant here, what else was abundant? Safety? Law? Choice? Dissent? The plate does not answer. It merely asks. And in some cases, after the war, the question kept asking. Former POWs returned to America. Some wrote letters. Some renewed friendships. Some immigrated. Some became citizens of the very country that had once been presented to them as the racial and political opposite of everything Germany was meant to become. Those later choices were not born from a single breakfast, but the breakfast belongs in the chain. History is often altered not by one grand conversion, but by the accumulation of humiliating observations. A train window, a hospital ward, a farm table, a pay ledger, a library, a slice of toast. That toast also carries a deeper symbolism about democracy itself. Democracy rarely looks majestic at close range. It looks improvised, procedural, repetitive, and faintly ridiculous. Its food is often plain. Its language is often vulgar. Its institutions creak, its people complain, its paperwork multiplies, its meals acquire nicknames like SOS. Yet hidden inside this ungainly surface is a remarkable claim. The system should be built so that enough exists for ordinary people, repeatedly, without miracle. Freedom, in this sense, is not only the right to speak, it is the right to expect breakfast not as favor but as function. For a German soldier shaped by a regime that worshipped hardness and staged grandeur, this could be more disorienting than any sermon. The Third Reich aestheticized struggle, America industrialized comfort. One promised glory through sacrifice without end. The other, at its best, promised that a citizen soldier, and even by law, an enemy prisoner, could be fitted into a machine that still recognized appetite as legitimate. That is not a complete definition of freedom, but in wartime, it is not a trivial one either. So, when we return to that dawn in 1943 or 1944, whether in Kansas or Texas or Maine, we should not imagine revelation as thunder. It was quieter than that. A prisoner sees white toast beneath chipped beef. He smells real coffee. He notices there is enough. He notices the guards eat the same kind of meal. He notices tomorrow seems already accounted for. The old certainties do not collapse. They loosen. And sometimes that loosening is where history begins to reclaim a human being from an ideology. The great lesson of the episode is not that American food was glamorous. It was that American plenty was systemic enough to appear unglamorous. The meal was not rich by restaurant standards. It was rich by civilizational standards. It said that the farms were producing, the rails were moving, the depots were stocked, the cooks were trained, the law was functioning, and the state imagined continuity. In the middle of World War, continuity itself was a form of power. And perhaps that is why the image endures so strongly. Not because SOS on toast was delicious beyond telling, but because it stood at the crossing of two 20th century faiths. One faith believed man was made noble by hardness, hunger, obedience, and myth. The other messier, flawed, often hypocritical but still formidable, believed that institutions should be strong enough to make ordinary life possible at scale. On one side, history as sacrifice. On the other, history as provision. On one side, slogans. On the other, toast. In the end, the breakfast line in an American POW camp tells us something larger than camp life. It tells us that freedom is not always recognized first in constitutions or flags. Sometimes it is recognized in the untheatrical fact that a society can feed even its enemies without turning the act into spectacle. Sometimes abundance is not decadence at all, but discipline of a higher order discipline in agriculture, transport, law, and civic expectation. Sometimes democracy smells like chipped beef and milk at dawn, and long after the ladles cooled, long after the camps emptied, long after the wire was cut down and the barracks weathered into memory, that slice of white toast remained in the imagination like a small, illuminated square. It had carried gravy once. It had carried salt and warmth and surprise. But beneath that, it had carried a revelation far heavier than its own weight, that a free society does not prove itself only by how fiercely it fights, but by how steadily it can sustain life, even in war, even in ugliness, even for men who arrived believing freedom was weak. In that sense, the toast was never just toast. It was the plain, astonishing shape of abundance made ordinary in the quiet sound, at the edge of an empire of slogans, of ideology beginning to starve while democracy had breakfast.